once this segment has ended, there will be time for discussion. So next up we have Andrea Burns. She is the co-chair of Peace Action's Legislative Committee. Presently the liaison for Our Revolution, Massachusetts, and she currently works at the City of Boston's Age Strong Elderly Commission. So let's give her a hearty welcome, Andrea Burns.
Thank you so much, everyone. Good afternoon. So what I'm going to talk about a little bit, and I could give you some of my time, Mike, if I don't go long enough. But so currently we do have a bill that I believe you've co-sponsored in the legislature that is called the People's Budget Resolution, and it's an act to establish a commission to report on the people's budget. So it is currently a bill in both houses, in the House and the Senate, and basically what it does is it asks for, it asks the legislature to ask our entire delegation to support the people's budget. So the Congressional People's Progressive Caucus has put out a people's budget, an alternative budget for multiple years, and they put one out in, I think, 2019. And so what we're really asking for is for our entire delegation to support it on the federal level. And then as a Section 2, we have put together a commission. And it's made up of a lot of different agencies and different entities that would actually study the impact of passage of the people's budget on the various sectors of Massachusetts. So we really felt that that was important, because then that gives people a sense of what would it mean if we pass this budget. What would it mean to education? What would it mean to environmental justice issues? What would it mean to healthcare issues? So we think that's a really good way, a good starting point to actually start developing a moral budget. And because I think it really gives people for so many of us don't really I don't understand the budget at all. But for me, it's a very arcane. I don't understand where it comes from, why we have the way that it's allocated, and all of those sorts of things. So it's really to kind of imagine what a real moral budget would be based on people's real needs. And so it's a good starting point. I hope everyone will encourage their legislators to sign on to this bill and to, well, it's in committee now, but to report it favorably out of committee so that we can, put this together. And I believe that this could be a starting point, I hope, for perhaps talk of a moral budget for Massachusetts specifically. So the things that I think are really helpful in terms of talking about it, many of Savina and Mike already mentioned, but also just sort of talking about the need here in Massachusetts. And there's a lot of incredible data that the Institute for Policy Studies and the Poor People's Campaign have put together specifically about Massachusetts. And it's incredibly compelling data. And I'll just give you an example. And when we did our testimony this week, there was some of the things that were brought up. Why do we need a people's budget here in Massachusetts? And the reason is, for so many reasons, including we have 43% of people living in poverty, low income or living in poverty, which is astounding. That includes 700,000 children, 1.6 million children, 1.1 million people of color, and 1.8 million Caucasians. Our income gap here grew by 334%, while the income for the top 1% grew by 334%, while the bottom 99% increased by only 33%. So these are just some examples of why we need this budget. Also making the case that Massachusetts, as a tiny state, has contributed $181 billion to the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. $181 billion just from Massachusetts, and imagine what that money could have done. And unfortunately, what it was spent on, which we don't have a choice in how that money is being spent. And to me, that's really a point to make. People are spending money in ways that I don't agree with. I don't want it to be spent in that way. I don't want $181 billion going to kill people in other countries for no reason. So then we also talk about how it would impact, okay? So $12 billion is given to states to transition to Medicare for all. That's in the people's budget. $12 billion will be given to states across the country. $2 trillion across the states to eliminate lead-contaminated water systems. $12.8 billion to eliminate family homelessness. It closes tax loopholes and subsidies to oil, gas, and coal. Expands access to mental health and treatments for opioid and heroin addiction, et cetera, et cetera. And it really gives a lot of support to transitioning away from fossil fuel systems. So it is a really hopeful budget, and so often when we don't know what to do and we think that nothing alternatively exists, it does exist. It has the most sponsors that it's ever had. I think since it started, I think there's 100 sponsors so far. So this is very hopeful. It is currently, it is an alternative budget that exists, and it really shows us a way forward that's really in a dramatically transformative direction that would really matter so much to so many people. So that's really all that I have so far, and thank you so much.
Whoa, 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 whoa. Easy does it.
Sorry. Who did I splash? Just put up that. So thanks for all of you getting here. Thanks for our speakers. So these budgetary appropriations by federal, state, and local governments, they are really the clearest statements of public priorities and social and economic values. Almost all Americans know that our legislators and executive branch leaders are elected by the citizenry. Most learn in junior high school and high school, at least I did in junior high school, that laws are written by the elected legislators. But budgets, the process is often murky and hidden. People have no idea that the budget process is separate from the legislative process. Despite collecting income taxes for more than 100 years, no agency of the federal government, not the IRS, not the Treasury, not the Congress, not the executive branch, has ever communicated back to taxpayers how the Congress voted their tax dollars in the last year. And let me tell you, if you want to find out about that, it is not easy, right? They have it buried really deep. As a result, most people, engaged citizens, my colleagues who are, professors at MIT, rarely have any accurate idea of how much money is spent on various programs. If you ask housing advocates, you ask people how much of the federal budget is spent on housing, their answers are all over the map. If you ask them how much is spent on the Pentagon, they say, or if I ask them, 10%, maybe 12%, 15%. So I go around to community groups and campuses, give a talk called, investing in mines, not missiles, if it's a campus, or build subways, not submarines, if it's a transit group. And I show this slide. One of our speakers is Lindsay Kashgari, and she's primarily responsible for this work. And as you see, more than half of our tax dollars go to the Pentagon. And my experience is people say, I don't believe that. If that was the case, I would have known that, right? And they're very skeptical. And you have to say, no, this is the actual data. And maybe this explains why the government has never shared this with you, because they know, right, that your attitude toward Afghanistan and the nuclear weapons might change. There's a little number up there about the NIH. Professor Mills Henry is going to talk about this a little more. It's where I spent my life, depending on the NIH budget. My colleagues, both locally and nationally, 250,000 around the country, are exquisitely aware of whether the NIH budget is going up by 100 million or 200 million or half a billion, whether it's going down. But if you ask them what fraction of the federal budget is the NIH budget, National Institute of Health Biomedical Research budget, they have no idea, because that is never reported. Science Magazine, which is the leading spokesperson for the scientific community, never ever publishes data in this form. They just say, well, the research component has increased by 5% or 4%. Now, the situation with the state budget is not quite so bad, because the appropriations are actually posted on the MassGov website. You can actually find them. But the process of setting the budget is murky. Historically, it's often been done by the leadership behind closed doors after midnight with little opportunity for amendment or debate. Riders are put onto it. There are some people here who have been in the trenches around the battle against MCAS, the high stakes test. For years, we tried to find out, how did that get, because the original legislation said multiple criteria for assessing people, and then this law came in that was actually different. For years, we couldn't find out where was the law that did that. Well, it was attached as a rider to a budget that had passed, midnight when no one was in session. Luckily, things are changing with the election of progressive reps like Mike Conley, like Denise, like Nika Lugardo, like Joe Comerford, Lindsay Sabadosa. We're now getting in the state legislature a group of legislators who aren't going to tolerate that, and the process is opening up a little bit, right? And they've won some reforms. So that's a yearly battle, right? The budget every year, the budget is battled. Now, so next spring, it'll start again. And it's going on in the state legislature, and of course it goes on in the national Congress. So the Congress last month authorized $738 billion for the Pentagon. That would make that fraction even larger than it is now. In the New York Times, the Boston Globe, you never hear that. You just heard that, well, there's a debate in Congress about the budget. So there's going to be a national campaign, there'll be a state campaign. Now, we're probably too late for this year's battle, but we hope, and this is one of the functions of this actual forum, is to identify those programs that would benefit from increased investment, and then calculate how much more they could be increased if the US Congress passed the people's budget or the moral budget. As you've heard, revising the Republican retrograde taxes, cutting the Pentagon budget, would make billions available for productive social investment, healthcare, education, transportation, environmental protection. So in the months that follow, I'm on the closing paragraph, thank you. In the months following, we hope to generate an actual draft moral budget, an actual document that you can hand around. And when Reverend Barber is here on February 5th and 6th, there'll be some big events with hundreds and hundreds of people, at the Strand Theater downtown. And hopefully one of the things that Savina will be able to do is to announce that we actually have a moral budget in Massachusetts, and then which we will distribute to our legislators and agency heads and advocacy organizations. And then when Mike and Denise are fighting in the parliamentary inside battle in the state legislature, we'll have a kind of document to kind of gather support on the outside for what it should be. Because if you don't have a vision of what it should be, if you go into the battle already having given up the ship, you're not going to get anything out of it. So we view the moral budget as representing a pole in that budget battle. And also, we think this can play a role for increasing pressure on our US congressional delegation to support the people's budget or the morals budget priorities in the congressional authorization and appropriation. Thanks for your attention.